After my husband died, his secret family from Ohio crashed his funeral, demanding his estate, his company, and everything I had helped build. My attorney begged me to fight them in court, but I looked at my mother-in-law and said, "Let them have it all." Everyone thought I was crazy to walk away from a multi-million empire. But at the final hearing, when I signed the transfer papers, their smug smiles vanished. Because their lawyer turned pale when he read exactly what they had just inherited. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever stood up to family. My name is Michelle, 33 years old, and I am a senior financial restructuring consultant and auditor. I stood near the catered buffet in the grand foyer of our sprawling Chicago estate, clutching a crystal glass of sparkling water. The heavy scent of white lilies mixed with the smell of expensive catered appetizers. The house was packed with mourners, business associates, and high society friends offering their hushed condolences. David, my husband of 5 years, had died suddenly of a massive heart attack just 3 days prior. My world had stopped spinning, leaving me in a state of shock. Yet as an auditor, my brain was trained to process data over emotion. I watched the room, nodding politely as people offered empty sympathies. The heavy oak front doors swung open, cutting through the low hum of polite conversation. The sudden draft of cold air made several guests turn their heads. A woman I had never seen before stepped into the foyer. She looked to be around my age, wearing a tight black dress that seemed inappropriate for a funeral. On her hip, she carried a toddler boy who shared David's exact shade of hazel eyes. Flanking her was a tall, heavily built man with a hostile scowl plastered across his face. The woman marched directly toward the center of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She did not look like a grieving friend or a distant relative. She moved with a sense of entitlement that demanded absolute attention. She stopped just a few feet away from me, her eyes sweeping over my tailored black suit with undisguised contempt. "I am David's legal wife from Columbus," she announced, her voice echoing off the high ceilings and carrying to every corner of the grand foyer. "You are just the Chicago placeholder." The entire room went dead silent. Waiters froze with trays of food. Guests stopped mid-sentence, their eyes darting between me, the unknown woman, and the toddler in her arms. My chest tightened, a cold wave of dread washing over me. Before I could process the sheer absurdity of her claim, movement caught my attention. Beatrice, my mother-in-law, stepped out from the stunned crowd. She did not look shocked or confused. Instead, a triumphant smirk played on her lips. Beatrice walked straight past me, ignoring my presence entirely, and wrapped her arms around the strange woman. She kissed the toddler's cheek affectionately, a display of warmth she had never shown me. Beatrice turned to face the crowd, raising her chin proudly. "David never loved this cold, calculating auditor," she announced, pointing a manicured finger at me. "He only married her for her connections to fund his logistics company. She was nothing but a bankroll. Crystal here is the mother of his true heir." The words hit me like a physical blow. Beatrice had always hated me, making it clear an accountant was not the glamorous wife she envisioned for her son. But this public declaration over his casket was an unanticipated cruelty. She was confirming my entire marriage was a calculated transaction. David had needed my savings and professional network to get Foster Freight off the ground. While I balanced his corporate ledgers, he traveled to Ohio every weekend to play house with his real family. The heavily built man beside Crystal stepped forward, invading my personal space. This was Derek, Crystal's brother, looking ready for a physical altercation. He reached into his jacket and shoved a thick manila folder into my chest. I stumbled back half a step, catching the folder. "We have a marriage certificate predating yours," Derek sneered loudly. "David never signed the divorce papers. Under state law, you are legally nothing to him. Your marriage is void. We are taking this house, we are taking Foster Freight, and we are taking every bank account. Pack your bags." I stood completely still, the eyes of 100 guests burning into my skin. The humiliation was designed to send me running in tears. A normal person would have screamed or collapsed under such a massive betrayal. But I was an auditor. I dealt with facts, liabilities, and assets. I slowly opened the manila folder and pulled out the document. My eyes scanned the official state seal, the dates, and David's unmistakable signature. It was real. I spent 5 years legally tied to a ghost. I looked up from the document, meeting Beatrice's smug, victorious gaze. She was waiting for me to shatter. Instead, I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the invoice I had received from the funeral director that very morning. I stepped forward, closing the distance between Crystal and myself. "If you are the legal wife, Crystal," I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion, "then you are legally responsible for today's expenses." I pressed the piece of paper flat against Crystal's chest, right over her heart, and let it go. She scrambled to catch it, her eyes widening as she read the bold print at the bottom. It was a $25,000 invoice for the luxury catering floral arrangements and premium casket. Beatrice's face flushed bright red with anger. "You will not get a dime of my son's multi-million-dollar empire," she screamed, her voice losing all its previous aristocratic polish. "We are taking it all." I did not argue. I simply turned my back on my mother-in-law, the secret wife, and the whispering guests and walked away. My heels clicked steadily against the hardwood floor as I made my way down the long corridor toward David's private home office. The sound of Beatrice shouting my name faded as I stepped inside and locked the heavy oak door. The office was dark, smelling faintly of David's expensive cologne. I walked over to his massive mahogany desk and sat in his leather executive chair. I pressed the power button on his custom encrypted computer system. The screen flared to life, casting a cold blue glow across the dark room. They wanted the empire. They wanted the house, the logistics company, and the supposed millions sitting in his corporate accounts. I typed in the backdoor administrative passwords I had quietly secured months ago when David first started acting suspicious with the company finances. The loading screen blinked as it bypassed his security firewalls. I leaned back in the chair, a cold, empty feeling settling deep in my stomach. Let them fight for the crown. I thought, sitting back and watching the detailed financial ledgers slowly populate on the glowing monitor before me. They have absolutely no idea what kind of toxic debt David was actually hiding here. 3 days passed in a blur of silent, meticulous preparation. I did not shed a single tear for the man I had buried. Instead, I spent every waking hour analyzing the digital wreckage of his double life. By the time I walked into the downtown Chicago offices of Thorne and Associates on Wednesday morning, my grief had been entirely replaced by cold, calculated clarity. The conference room was a sterile box of glass and steel overlooking the gray expanse of Lake Michigan. I sat on one side of the massive mahogany table next to my attorney, Daniel Thorne. Daniel was a sharp, seasoned litigator who had known David and me for years. Across from us sat the invading army. Beatrice wore a tailored black suit that looked brand new, her posture rigid with triumph. Next to her sat Crystal, wearing a designer scarf that I immediately recognized as a charge on David's platinum card from 2 months ago. Derek slouched in his leather chair, crossing his arms and glaring at me as if I were a trespasser. Flanking them was Richard Caldwell. He was the kind of high-priced, aggressive bulldog lawyer who made his living terrorizing people into submission. He did not bother with pleasantries or condolences. The moment the heavy door clicked shut, Caldwell dropped a thick stack of documents onto the center of the table with a loud smack. He adjusted his silk tie and looked at me with absolute disdain. "The documents you see before you are certified copies of the original legally binding marriage certificate between David Foster and Crystal Foster, issued in the state of Ohio." He tapped the stack with a heavy gold pen. "We have confirmed with the county clerk that no divorce petition was ever filed or finalized. Under the laws of both Ohio and Illinois, your subsequent marriage to David is entirely void. You were never his legal wife, Michelle. Legally speaking, you are an absolute stranger to his estate." I kept my face perfectly blank, staring at the thick stack of paper. Daniel shifted in his seat, ready to tear Caldwell apart, but Caldwell raised his voice, moving straight into the extortion. "Because you are legally nothing to David." Caldwell continued, leaning forward so his shadow fell across the table. "My clients are taking immediate and full possession of all marital and corporate assets. We demand that you surrender all claims to Foster Freight, which our preliminary assessments value at no less than $18 million. We also require you to immediately vacate the Chicago estate and sign over all access to David's personal and business investment portfolios. Daniel scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. You cannot walk into a room present an out-of-state document and demand my client hand over an $18 million logistics company that she helped build. We will take this to probate court immediately. We will demand a full forensic accounting of all assets, and we will drag out the ownership of Foster Freight for years if we have to. Michelle contributed her own capital to that house and that business. Caldwell smiled, a nasty, predatory showing of teeth. I was hoping you would say that, Daniel, because if your client decides to fight us in probate court, things will get remarkably ugly for her very fast. Caldwell opened a separate folder and slid a single sheet of paper toward me. It was a drafted press release bearing the letterhead of a prominent Chicago financial blog. My clients are fully prepared to go to the press and the governing ethics board of your profession, Caldwell said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. You are a senior forensic accountant, Michelle. Your entire career is built on trust, transparency, and spotting financial discrepancies. If you force us into a legal battle, we will publicly accuse you of embezzling corporate funds during your fraudulent marriage. We will argue that you used your position as an auditor to manipulate David's ledgers and steal from his rightful family. Even if you manage to clear your name in 5 years, the mere accusation will destroy your consulting firm. Your partners will fire you by the end of the week to save their own reputations. The sheer audacity of the threat hung in the cold air of the conference room. They were not just trying to take the company and the house, they were trying to completely annihilate my livelihood. They wanted to strip me of the one thing I had built entirely on my own merits. Derek leaned forward, pointing a thick finger at me. You have no leverage here. You sign over the company, the house, and the cash, or we ruin you. We take your career, your reputation, and your money. You will be blacklisted in every accounting firm in the Midwest before the month is over. I looked at Derek, then shifted my gaze to Crystal. She was sitting back watching me with a satisfied smirk, entirely convinced that she had finally defeated the wealthy Chicago wife. But it was Beatrice who delivered the final venomous blow. My mother-in-law placed her hands flat on the mahogany table and leaned across it, her eyes blazing with years of suppressed hatred. She wanted to make sure her words inflicted maximum damage. Your little number-crunching gig bored him to death, Michelle Beatrice said, her voice dripping with malice. Did you really think my son wanted to spend his life with a sterile calculating machine? You gave him nothing but nagging and spreadsheets. He came to Ohio every single weekend to be a real man with a real family. Crystal gave him a beautiful son. She gave him warmth. You were just a temporary bankroll to get his business off the ground. Beatrice paused, letting the insult sink into the silence of the room. Then she sneered. So go ahead. Sign the waiver right now, or we will bankrupt you in court. We will take every last cent you have, and we will make sure the whole world knows you were just a pathetic, unwanted placeholder. Daniel turned red with fury. He slammed his hand on the table, causing the water glasses to rattle. This is blatant extortion, Richard, and you know it. We are not intimidated by your baseless threats. I am filing an emergency injunction this afternoon. We are going to freeze every single corporate asset attached to Foster Freight. We are freezing the bank accounts, the properties, and the investments. You will not be able to touch a single dime of David's money until a federal judge untangles this mess, and I guarantee you I will make sure my client gets her rightful share. Daniel reached into his leather briefcase, pulling out a thick legal pad to draft the immediate injunction. He was doing exactly what a good lawyer should do. He was protecting my assets, fighting for my survival, and preparing to lock the company in a legal standstill that could last for years. It was the smart move. It was the logical move. But it was the absolute last thing I wanted. I turned to Daniel. I let my shoulders slump forward. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged, channeling the exhaustion and devastation of a woman who had just realized her entire life was a lie. I needed them to believe I was completely broken. I needed them to think their brutal tactics had worked perfectly. I reached out and placed a trembling hand over Daniel's arm, gently pushing the legal pad back down onto the table. Daniel froze, looking at me in utter confusion. Daniel, no, I said, my voice wavering just enough to sound fragile and defeated. Please stop. Michelle, what are you doing? Daniel whispered frantically, leaning in close so only I could hear. They are bluffing. We can win this. If we freeze the assets today, we cut off their oxygen. We force them to negotiate. Do not let them bully you out of your own company. I kept my eyes wide and glassy, staring at Caldwell and Beatrice. I let a single perfect tear escape, tracking slowly down my cheek. I took a shaky breath and spoke just loud enough for the opposing side to hear every single word. I will not fight you, I whispered, my voice thick with manufactured grief. Daniel stared at me in absolute horror. He opened his mouth to argue, but I squeezed his arm tighter, silencing him. Across the table, the shift in the room was instantaneous. Caldwell sat back in his chair, his chest puffing out with victorious pride. Derek nudged Crystal, grinning like a man who had just won the lottery. Beatrice let out a long, satisfied sigh, her eyes raking over my slumped posture with absolute delight. I looked down at the mahogany table, keeping my face hidden from my own lawyer. Daniel thought I was giving up millions of dollars out of fear. Beatrice and Crystal thought they had just secured an $18 million logistics empire. They thought they had crushed me. But behind the veil of my fake tears, a cold, ruthless smile was fighting to break through. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. The heavy wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor. I need a private recess with my attorney, I said. My voice was intentionally soft and shaky, projecting the image of a woman on the verge of a total mental collapse. Caldwell smirked, leaning back in his leather chair and waving his hand like a king, granting a peasant a temporary reprieve. Take 10 minutes, Caldwell said, his voice dripping with condescension. Take 20 if you need it, but the paperwork will be right here waiting for your signature when you get back. Beatrice chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that grated against my ears. You cannot hide from the truth, Michelle. Beatrice taunted as I turned toward the door. It is time to face reality. I kept my head bowed, refusing to make eye contact with any of them, and walked out through the heavy glass doors into the bright corridor. Daniel followed me immediately. As soon as the conference room door clicked shut behind us, he grabbed my elbow and guided me quickly down the hallway toward a small, empty consultation room. He closed the solid wooden door behind us, ensuring we were in absolute privacy. His face was flushed red with a mixture of professional outrage and protective anger. He slammed his legal pad onto a small side table and turned to face me. Michelle, what on earth are you doing? Daniel demanded in a fierce, hushed whisper. You cannot just give up. I will not let you throw away everything you have worked for because of some cheap intimidation tactics. Caldwell is a bully, but his threats about the press and your professional license are completely baseless. I kept my face turned away for a moment, letting him vent his frustration. You put down the initial deposit on that Chicago estate. Daniel continued pacing the length of the small room. You were the one who co-signed the massive commercial loan for the first fleet of trucks for Foster Freight. Without your pristine credit history and your financial backing, David would have never gotten that logistics company off the ground. You cannot let these terrible people walk into an arbitration room, present a highly questionable out-of-state marriage document, and steal your entire life. We have a solid legal standing to fight this. I listened to the ticking of the wall clock, letting his words hang in the quiet air. Then I took a deep breath and wiped the fake tears from my cheeks. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back and lifting my chin. The defeated, fragile widow posture melted away, instantly replaced by the sharp, calculating professional I truly was. I looked Daniel directly in the eyes. My gaze was steady, clear, and completely ice-cold. Daniel stopped pacing mid-step. He stared at me, his brow furrowing as he realized my emotional breakdown inside the boardroom had been nothing more than a flawless theatrical performance. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a small black encrypted USB drive. I held it up between us, the metal casing catching the overhead light. Daniel, I do not want to freeze the assets, I said, keeping my voice low and perfectly even. I want to accelerate the transfer. Let them take the company immediately. In fact, we are going to insist on bypassing probate completely. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked from the drive in my hand to my face, trying to comprehend my sudden drastic shift in strategy. Bypass probate, he finally repeated, his lawyer brain struggling to catch up. Michelle, if you bypass probate, you waive your right to a mandatory discovery period. You waive your right to contest the asset distribution. They will take every single thing David owned. I smiled a genuine, ruthless smile. That is exactly what I'm counting on, I told him. For the past 72 hours, while Beatrice and Crystal thought I was weeping into my pillow, I have not been grieving at all. I have been awake. I bypassed the security firewalls on David's encrypted home servers. I did a complete, ruthless forensic audit of Foster Freight and his personal finances. I stepped closer to Daniel, gripping the USB drive tightly. What Caldwell just presented in that room is an absolute fantasy. Foster Freight is not an $18 million logistics empire. It is a hollow shell company drowning in toxic debt, illegal gambling loans, and cooked books. Daniel blinked slowly, the color draining from his face, as the reality of my words began to sink in. What do you mean, cooked books? He asked. I mean a massive shadow ledger, I explained. David was running a brilliant but entirely illegal dual accounting system. The $18 million valuation Caldwell is salivating over is based on fraudulent revenue projections, fake client contracts, and inflated asset appraisals. The reality is that the company is completely underwater. David took out massive illegal loans from underground gambling syndicates to fund his double life in Ohio. The corporate accounts are completely drained. Foster Freight owes millions more than it is actually worth. Daniel stared at me in absolute shock. And the Chicago estate, he asked. The house is leveraged to the breaking point, I replied without missing a beat. David took out 3 separate secret mortgages against the property using forged documents and shell corporations. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul, and the music was finally about to stop. His fatal heart attack was likely triggered by the immense stress of knowing his entire financial house of cards was just days away from a catastrophic collapse. I watched the realization fully wash over Daniel's face. If Beatrice and Crystal signed the papers to assume control of the estate today, they were not inheriting generational wealth. They were eagerly volunteering to inherit a massive financial crater. By demanding everything, they were actually demanding to take on millions in toxic liabilities. But there was one more crucial piece to the puzzle. It gets even better, I said, softly, leaning against the small side table. While digging through the hidden ledgers on this drive, I found a very interesting series of encrypted email trails and offshore wire transfers. Beatrice was not just a clueless, grieving mother supporting her golden child. She actively helped David hide money from his legitimate corporate creditors. She set up dummy LLCs in her own name to funnel whatever cash was left out of the logistics company. Daniel let out a low breath. She is completely complicit, he said. I nodded. Exactly. Beatrice thinks she is orchestrating a brilliant, masterful heist today. She thinks she is using Crystal and that predated marriage certificate to secure the remaining cash before I have a chance to find it. She is utterly convinced that she is outsmarting a naive accountant. She is completely oblivious to the radioactive financial wasteland David actually left behind. She only saw the money he was skimming into her accounts, not the massive black hole of debt he was creating to do it. I placed the encrypted USB drive back into my blazer pocket and smoothed the lapels. So we are going to go back into that conference room, Daniel. We are going to play the role of the terrified, defeated victims perfectly. We will not file an injunction. We will not fight them in probate court. We will give them exactly what they are so desperately asking for. Let them take the crown and let them drown with the ship. Daniel looked at me, a slow grin spreading across his face as he finally understood the sheer magnitude of the trap they had set for themselves. He picked up his legal pad. Let us go give them the company, he said. We stepped back into the hallway, leaving the quiet sanctuary of the consultation room behind us. I let my shoulders drop forward, adopting the hunched, fragile posture I had perfected moments before. Daniel walked beside me, his jaw clenched tight, doing a spectacular job of looking like an attorney who had just lost a massive argument with his own client. I pushed open the heavy glass door of the conference room and stepped back into the lion den. The atmosphere inside was suffocatingly smug. Beatrice was already sipping from a crystal water glass, her posture radiating absolute victory. Crystal was examining her manicured nails, completely unbothered by the gravity of the situation, while the toddler slept in a stroller parked in the corner. Derek smirked as I took my seat, letting out a short, derisive scoff that echoed in the quiet space. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the polished mahogany wood of the table, refusing to meet their gazes. Caldwell drummed his heavy gold pen against his legal pad. "Well," he demanded, his voice cutting through the silence with arrogant authority. "Have we come to our senses? Or do I need to make that phone call to the press and ruin your entire accounting career right now?" Daniel leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. His face was a mask of bitter resentment. "My client has instructed me against my strongest legal advice to concede to your demands." The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation. I took a shaky breath, letting my voice tremble just enough to sound completely broken. "I do not have the emotional strength for a prolonged court battle," I whispered, keeping my gaze directed at my trembling hands folded in my lap. "David is gone. Finding out about all of this today, about you, Crystal, and the secret life he led, it has destroyed whatever was left of my world." I forced a tear to well up and spill over my eyelashes, tracking slowly down my cheek. "If you want the company and the Chicago estate, you can have them." Beatrice let out a sharp, victorious breath, but I raised my hand slightly to stop Caldwell before he could begin to gloat. However, I continued, my voice barely above a whisper. "I cannot spend the next 2 years dragging this through probate court. I cannot deal with the lawyers, the audits, the constant reminders of what he did to me. I want a clean break. If you want the estate, you must take it all today. An absolute, irrevocable transfer of the entire estate, bypassing probate completely." Caldwell narrowed his eyes for a fraction of a second, his predatory instincts searching for a catch. "Bypass probate," he repeated slowly, leaning back in his leather chair. "That is highly unusual. You are waiving your right to an inventory of the assets. You are handing over everything without a fight." I looked up at him, my eyes wide and swimming with manufactured tears. "I do not care about an inventory," I cried softly, letting a note of desperation bleed into my voice. "I just want this nightmare to end. Every single day I spend tied to David is a day I cannot heal. I want to walk away and never hear the name Foster Freight again." Daniel slammed his hand on the table again, playing his part beautifully. "She is handing you an $18 million company on a silver platter?" Daniel snapped, glaring at Caldwell with intense, fabricated frustration. "You bypass the courts and you bypass the waiting periods. My client wants out, and I am bound by her instructions to facilitate it. If you want the money, take the deal before she changes her mind." Derek leaned over the table and whispered frantically into Caldwell's ear. I could see the naked, ravenous greed lighting up Derek's face. He thought they had just pulled off the heist of the century. He was imagining the sports cars, the luxury vacations, the absolute power of suddenly becoming a millionaire. Beatrice looked at me with pure disgust, completely buying the act of the weak, defeated widow running away from a fight because she lacked the backbone to stand her ground. Caldwell straightened his silk tie, a deeply arrogant smile spreading across his face. He truly believed he had successfully bullied a weak woman into surrendering an empire. "Very well," Caldwell said smoothly, pulling a fresh sheet of paper toward him. "We will draft an assumption of all assets and liabilities. This document will legally transfer the entirety of David Estate, the company, the properties, and all associated holdings directly to my clients." Caldwell looked over at Crystal, offering her a reassuring, patronizing nod. "This will lock her out forever, Crystal. She will not be able to claim a single paperclip once this is signed." I reached into my purse and pulled out a tissue, dabbing delicately at the corners of my eyes. "Make sure the contract explicitly states that I am legally severed from all future profits and operations," I insisted, letting my voice crack perfectly on the last word. "I do not want any ties to his business. I do not want a percentage of future earnings. I just want my name completely removed from the corporate registry and the estate entirely. Caldwell let out a loud, mocking laugh that filled the glass-walled room. Do not worry yourself about future profits, Michelle. You will not see a dime of them. The assumption of all assets and liabilities means exactly that. My clients assume everything. You walk away with absolutely nothing. He was so blinded by the prospect of securing the massive assets that he completely ignored the second half of that legal term. Liabilities. By drafting the document exactly as I requested, Caldwell was inadvertently sealing his own client's doom. He was legally binding Beatrice, Crystal, and Derek to David toxic financial wasteland without a single safety net or a 30-day discovery period. They were waiving their right to look under the hood of the company before buying it. They assumed the company value was based entirely on the flashy, fabricated lifestyle David had maintained in Ohio. They had no idea about the massive gambling debts, the hollowed-out corporate accounts, or the cooked books. I will have the final transfer documents ready for signature by Friday afternoon. Caldwell declared, snapping his briefcase shut with a crisp, authoritative thud. I suggest you show up ready to sign, Michelle. If you try to delay or play games, my offer of silence regarding your professional reputation expires instantly. I will be there, I whispered, keeping my head bowed in a posture of total surrender. Beatrice stood up, smoothing the front of her expensive black jacket. She looked down at me, her eyes practically shining with malice and triumph. You finally realized your place, Michelle. Beatrice said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. You were just a stepping stone, a temporary bank account. David's real legacy belongs to his real family. You can go back to your lonely, miserable little spreadsheets now. I did not respond. I let them have the last word. Daniel and I stood up in silence and walked out of the conference room, leaving them to celebrate their hollow victory. We did not speak as we walked down the long corridor toward the elevators. The walk felt incredibly long, my heart hammering against my ribs with the sheer adrenaline of what we had just pulled off. As the elevator doors slid shut, sealing us off from the law firm, Daniel let out a massive breath, running a hand through his hair. He looked at me, a mixture of absolute awe and disbelief on his face. He shook his head, letting out a low chuckle, but before he could say a single word, my phone vibrated deeply in the pocket of my blazer. I pulled it out and looked at the illuminated screen. It was a silent, encrypted text message from my contact at the Federal Financial Regulatory Agency. I read the brief string of words, a cold, genuine smile finally breaking across my face. A ticking time bomb had just been activated, and Beatrice and Crystal had just demanded to hold it with both hands. The drive from Richard Caldwell's law office back to my downtown consulting firm passed in a blur of city traffic and rain-slicked streets. My mind was racing far ahead of the taxi moving through the Chicago financial district. The text message from my federal contact burned a hole in my memory. I paid the driver, stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, and walked into the soaring glass atrium of my building. The security guard nodded as I swiped my badge, but I barely registered his greeting. I needed to get to my desk. I needed to see the full scope of the devastation David had engineered. My office was a sanctuary of order. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the river, but my focus was entirely on the 3 large monitors arranged across my desk. I locked the door behind me, tossed my blazer onto the small leather sofa, and sat down. I plugged the encrypted USB drive back into my secure terminal. The shadow ledger David had kept hidden was massive, but my initial quick audit had only scratched the surface of his deceit. I needed to perform a complete financial autopsy. I needed to map every single infected artery of Foster Freight before Friday. I started pulling up the operational reports for his Ohio facilities. David had always been incredibly defensive about the Columbus warehouses, claiming they were the backbone of his regional expansion. As I dug into the compliance folders buried under layers of password protection, the true nature of his Ohio operations came into sharp focus. He was not expanding his logistics network. He was running an illegal, hazardous waste disposal scheme. My eyes scanned over dozens of internal emails and scanned federal notices that David had desperately tried to bury. For the past 4 years, Foster freight trucks had been illegally dumping toxic chemical runoff at unauthorized sites across rural Ohio to cut costs and artificially inflate the company profit margins. The Environmental Protection Agency had not just caught wind of it, they had compiled a mountain of undeniable evidence. I opened a document tagged with a red priority marker. It was a formal notice of impending penalty from the EPA. The fine was staggering. $14 million. $14 million. The federal government was holding Foster Freight entirely responsible for the environmental cleanup and the illegal dumping violations. David had received the final warning notice just 10 days before his death. He knew the walls were closing in. He knew his company was about to be obliterated by federal regulators. But the $14 million environmental fine was only the first layer of the nightmare. I shifted my attention to the payroll and tax subfolders. David had always insisted on handling the corporate taxes himself, claiming he did not want to burden my consulting schedule with his small business paperwork. The reality was that he could never let a forensic accountant look at his books. I cross-referenced his internal payroll ledgers with the official tax filings. The discrepancy was glaring. David had been engaged in severe corporate fraud and payroll tax evasion for years. He had been withholding federal income taxes from his employees' paychecks, and instead of remitting those funds to the government, he was funneling the cash into untraceable offshore accounts. He was using the stolen tax money to fund the lavish lifestyle he maintained for his secret family in Ohio. The Internal Revenue Service had already completed their audit. I found the final determination letter sitting in a folder labeled Personal. The IRS was levying a $5 million tax lien against Foster Freight and David personally. They were moving to seize corporate assets. I leaned back in my chair, running a hand over my tired eyes. $19 million in federal penalties and liens. David was drowning. I found correspondence between his criminal defense attorney and a federal prosecutor. David was literally weeks away from a federal indictment. He was facing years in a federal penitentiary for fraud and tax evasion. The sudden massive heart attack that took his life 3 days ago was not a random medical anomaly. It was the physical manifestation of absolute terror. He died knowing he was about to lose everything and go to prison. I needed to know how much Beatrice and Crystal actually knew about this. If they were complicit in the dumping or the tax fraud, they might see the trap coming. I navigated to his personal email archives and searched for communications with his mother and his secret wife. What I found was a pathetic tragedy of greed and delusion. I read through hundreds of emails and text message transcripts that painted a crystal-clear picture of the Ohio family blind spot. Beatrice and Crystal knew absolutely nothing about the impending federal indictments. They knew nothing about the EPA fines or the IRS liens. They only knew the superficial wealth David paraded in front of them. There were emails from Crystal demanding a new luxury SUV because the lease on her current vehicle was ending. David responded instantly, promising to buy her the top-of-the-line model in cash. There were messages from Beatrice complaining about her country club dues and asking David to fund a lavish European vacation for her and Derek. David never said no. He never told them finances were tight. He simply stole more money from his employees and cooked the books further to maintain the facade of the golden child. Beatrice truly believed her son was a brilliant self-made logistics tycoon. Crystal believed she was married to a multimillionaire. They were entirely blinded by the expensive dinners, the designer clothes, and the limitless corporate credit cards David threw at them. They never asked where the money was coming from because they felt entitled to it. They looked at me, the professional woman who actually worked for her money, and saw only a cold spreadsheet machine. They had no idea that the money they loved so much was stolen from the federal government. I sat perfectly still in the quiet hum of my office, the pieces of the puzzle locking together with terrifying precision. Richard Caldwell was currently sitting in his glass-walled conference room drafting an assumption of all assets and liabilities contract. He was writing a legally binding document intended to lock me out of the estate and hand complete ownership of Foster Freight to Crystal and Beatrice. If they went through probate court, a judge would appoint an executor to inventory the estate. The executor would immediately discover the EPA fines and the IRS liens. The estate would be liquidated to pay the federal government, and Beatrice and Crystal would walk away with nothing, but they would be legally protected from the debt itself. But Caldwell, in his absolute greed and arrogance, was insisting on bypassing probate completely. He was demanding an immediate, irrevocable transfer of the company and all its liabilities directly to his clients. He thought he was outsmarting me to secure $18 million in hidden cash. My heart pounded a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs as the brilliance of their mistake washed over me. If Caldwell filed that assumption contract, Beatrice and Crystal would not just inherit a bankrupt logistics company. They would legally and personally inherit David federal crimes. By assuming all corporate liabilities known and unknown, they would become fully responsible for the $14 million EPA fine and the $5 million IRS tax lien. The federal government would not care that David was dead. The government would simply look at the new legal owners of Foster Freight and demand their $19 million. I looked at the calendar on my desk. The timing was a razor-thin wire. My federal contact had warned me that the IRS and EPA liens were moving out of the confidential investigation phase. They were scheduled to hit the public federal registry on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Once those liens were public, Caldwell would see them. Any first-year law clerk running a basic background check would see them. If Caldwell saw the federal liens before the transfer was signed, he would cancel the deal immediately and advise his clients to walk away. They demanded to sign the papers this Friday afternoon. I had exactly 24 hours to keep the illusion alive. I had to remain the broken, defeated widow who was too terrified of court to fight for her company. I had to let them bully me, let them insult me, and let them think they had won. I had to hold my breath and guide them right to the edge of the cliff, letting their own insatiable greed push them over. I reached out and powered down my monitors, plunging the office into comfortable shadows. The Ohio family wanted David legacy. On Friday afternoon, I was going to give it to them completely. The peaceful silence of my Thursday morning was shattered just before 10 o'clock. I was reviewing a massive merger file for a pharmaceutical client when a violent commotion erupted outside my heavy glass office door. The headquarters of Vance & Associates was typically a fortress of hushed voices and corporate discretion. But Derek did not care about decorum. I heard the frantic clicking of my assistant heels on the polished marble floor, followed by a loud, aggressive bellow. "Get out of my way! I am not leaving until I speak to whoever runs this place!" Derek roared. I stood up slowly as my door was shoved open. Derek barged into the room, his face flushed a furious shade of red. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his chest heaved as he pointed a fleshy finger directly at my face. I crossed my arms and stared at him, letting the cold silence stretch between us. "What exactly do you think you are accomplishing here, Derek?" I asked. "You are not going to get away with it," he spat, taking a threatening step forward. "Caldwell might have let you off the hook yesterday, but I am not nearly as stupid. I know exactly what you are trying to do, Michelle. You are trying to hide the money before Friday." I stared at him in absolute disbelief. "I am not hiding anything," I replied, my tone flat. "I agreed to your lawyer's demands. The estate is yours tomorrow. What more could you possibly want?" "I want you ruined!" Derek shouted, his voice echoing down the entire executive hallway. "I want your bosses to know exactly what kind of criminal they have working for them." Right on cue, the heavy mahogany door of the adjoining corner office swung open. Marcus Vance, the senior managing partner of the firm, stepped into the doorway. Marcus was a man who commanded absolute authority without ever having to raise his voice. He was a ruthless corporate veteran with 30 years of experience navigating the most treacherous financial waters. He wore a bespoke Italian suit and an expression of utter disdain as he looked at the sweating, red-faced man trespassing in his firm. "What is the meaning of this disruption?" Marcus asked, his voice smooth, cold, and carrying an undeniable edge of menace. Derek spun around, sizing Marcus up and completely misreading the situation. "Are you the guy in charge here?" Derek demanded, thrusting his chest out in a pathetic attempt at intimidation. Because you need to know that your precious senior accountant is a total fraud. She is a criminal and you need to fire her immediately before she ruins your company too. Marcus slowly folded his hands behind his back. He did not blink. He did not react to the shouting. He simply let Derek continue to dig his own grave. She has been cooking the books for my dead brother company, Derek yelled, turning back to point at me. She is a sterile, boring spreadsheet jockey who could not keep a man to save her life. Now she is trying to embezzle from his real family. She is trying to steal an $18 million logistics empire from my mother and my nephew. You need to drop her from all your senior accounts right now. If you do not fire her today, I will go to the press and tell them this entire firm is helping a bitter widow steal from a grieving family. The sheer audacity of the threat hung in the air. Derek stood there panting slightly, an arrogant smirk creeping onto his face. He truly believed he had just delivered a fatal blow to my career. He believed that his loud, aggressive bullying tactics would work in a high-powered corporate financial firm the same way they worked in a dingy neighborhood bar. I looked at Marcus, waiting for his reaction. Marcus slowly walked forward, stopping just a few feet away from Derek. He looked the sweating man up and down with an expression of profound boredom. "Are you quite finished?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Derek blinked, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. "I am telling you to fire her," he insisted, though his voice lacked the booming confidence it had just moments before. Marcus turned his head slightly, looking over his shoulder toward the hallway. Two large security guards dressed in immaculate black suits had just arrived, standing silently behind Derek. "Remove this man from my building," Marcus ordered, waving a dismissive hand in Derek's direction. "If he resists, call the Chicago Police Department and press charges for criminal trespassing and corporate harassment." Derek's eyes went wide with shock as the two guards stepped forward, grabbing him firmly by both arms. "Wait, what are you doing?" he protested, struggling uselessly against their iron grips. "I am trying to warn you about her. She is stealing from us. She is a criminal. You are a loud, poorly dressed nuisance trespassing in a secure facility," Marcus replied, turning his back on Derek completely. "Get him out of here." The guards did not hesitate. They practically lifted Derek off his feet and dragged him backward out of my office. Derek began to panic, his face turning a deep shade of purple as he realized his intimidation tactic had failed spectacularly. He thrashed and kicked, but the guards simply tightened their hold. "You cannot do this to me," he screamed as they dragged him down the long marble corridor toward the elevators. "I am going to own a massive company tomorrow. I am going to ruin both of you. Do you hear me? I will destroy this entire firm." His frantic shouting faded into the distance, eventually silenced by the heavy ping and closing doors of the elevator. The quiet hum of the corporate office slowly returned. I stood in the center of my office, straightening the cuffs of my silk blouse. I looked over at Marcus, who was brushing an imaginary speck of dust off his immaculate suit jacket. He walked over to my heavy oak door and quietly pushed it shut, sealing us inside the soundproof room. Marcus had known David for years. He had also known about David's sudden death and the bizarre appearance of the Ohio family. But more importantly, Marcus was the one who had taught me how to read the stories buried deep within corporate tax filings. He knew exactly what kind of financial predator David had truly been, because Marcus and I had spent the last 2 days secretly reviewing the encrypted files I had pulled from David's server. Marcus walked over to my desk and leaned against the edge, crossing his arms over his chest. A slow, dark smile spread across his weathered face. He looked in the direction the elevator had taken Derek and let out a soft, sophisticated chuckle. "Well," Marcus said, his eyes gleaming with professional satisfaction. "That was certainly a spectacular display of aggressive stupidity. I suppose the brother is not the brains of the Ohio operation." "There are no brains in the Ohio operation," I replied, walking back around my desk and sitting down in my high-backed leather chair. "Is the trap set?" Marcus asked, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur. I just nodded coldly. "The signing is Friday. They have no idea they are fighting over a sinking ship loaded with federal dynamite. The rest of Thursday afternoon dissolved into a haze of quiet preparation. I drove toward the suburban estate David and I had purchased 5 years ago. The massive stone structure projected the image of stable generational wealth that David was desperate to convey. I pulled into the driveway and walked inside, greeted by the echoing silence of the empty foyer. I simply stood in the shadows of the living room, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain against the tall glass windows, waiting for the inevitable. At exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy brass knocker echoed violently. Caldwell had informed his clients I was surrendering, and they could not wait until the next afternoon to claim their prize. They needed to twist the knife. I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders slump forward, adopting the defeated, fragile posture I had perfected in the boardroom. I opened the thick oak door, and the freezing evening air swept into the entry hall. Beatrice and Crystal stood under the covered awning. Behind them stood a burly locksmith holding a canvas tool bag and a uniformed Chicago police officer, looking uncomfortable standing in the freezing rain. Crystal clutched folded cardboard moving boxes. Beatrice wore a trench coat pulled tightly around her waist and a smile of absolute triumphant malice. The police officer cleared his throat, shifting his weight awkwardly. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, polite but firm. "I am here on a civil standby to keep the peace. These women have presented legal documentation claiming they are the rightful heirs to this property and requested an escort to ensure the premises are secured." Beatrice stepped forward aggressively, waving a thick stack of papers. "You have no legal right to be in my son house anymore. Michelle." Beatrice snapped, her voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear over the rain. "We know you are signing everything over Friday, but we are not going to let you spend the next 24 hours stripping this place of its valuables. You are going to pack a bag and vacate this property immediately. We are changing the locks tonight." I looked at the police officer, letting my eyes widen with manufactured humiliation. I let my breathing become shallow, wrapping my arms around myself. "You do not need to do this," I whispered, my voice trembling perfectly. "I am not trying to take anything that belongs to David. I will go. Just please let me pack some clothes." Beatrice let out a harsh, satisfied scoff. "Make it quick," she ordered, pushing past me into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. Crystal followed, dropping the moving boxes onto the floor with a loud thud. The locksmith stepped inside and began unscrewing the brass deadbolt. I turned and walked slowly up the staircase, resting my hand heavily on the banister to sell my utter exhaustion. I could hear the sharp clicking of Crystal heels echoing right behind me. She followed me down the corridor and into the master bedroom. The suite featured vaulted ceilings, a marble fireplace, and a huge walk-in closet. Crystal stepped into the room, looking around with wide, greedy eyes. I pulled a single medium-sized suitcase from the closet and laid it flat on the mattress. I began opening drawers, pulling out basic sweaters, jeans, and comfortable shoes. I did not touch the designer dresses or the expensive handbags. Crystal ignored my packing. She strutted across the room, acting as if she had already lived there for years. She walked directly to my mirrored vanity and opened the top drawer where I kept my jewelry box. "Please do not touch that," I said, letting a note of desperate pleading slip into my voice. "Those are my personal things." Crystal let out a short, nasty laugh. "Nothing in this house belongs to you anymore," she said, flipping the lid of the velvet box open. She began picking through the delicate gold chains, tossing them carelessly aside. Her eyes landed on a heavy diamond tennis bracelet. David had given it to me for our 5th anniversary. Crystal pulled it out, holding it up so the diamonds fractured the overhead light. She smiled a slow, greedy smile and wrapped the diamond bracelet around her own wrist, snapping the clasp shut. "This looks much better on me anyway," Crystal taunted, holding her arm out to admire the jewels. "David bought this with my family money. Consider it returned to its rightful owner." I closed my eyes and took a shaky breath, gripping the edge of the mattress. Before I could answer, the heavy footsteps of my mother-in-law sounded in the hallway. Beatrice walked into the master bedroom, crossing her arms over her chest. She looked from my suitcase to my trembling hands, and finally to my face. "You were never going to fit into this family, Michelle," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a low, cruel pitch. You have no warmth. You are just a machine. A sterile calculating machine who only cares about spreadsheets. I kept my head down, folding a gray sweater and placing it into my suitcase. Crystal gave him a son. Beatrice continued stepping closer to deliver her venomous words right into my face. Crystal gave him a real home. She gave him warmth and love. You gave him nothing but nagging. You drove him right back to Ohio where he actually belonged. I zipped up the suitcase, the sound loud in the tense silence of the bedroom. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or attempt to defend myself against their bitter accusations. I picked up the handle of the suitcase and walked toward the bedroom door. Crystal stepped aside, a triumphant smirk plastered across her face, while Beatrice watched me go with vindictive pleasure. I walked down the grand staircase for the final time. The locksmith had already finished replacing the front door cylinder. The police officer stood near the doorway, looking relieved that the eviction had happened without any screaming. I pulled my house key off my keyring and set it quietly on the entryway console table, handing over the keys without a fight. I walked out the front door and down the porch steps, stepping out directly into the freezing rain. I walked at a slow, steady pace toward my car, feeling the heavy drops of water soaking into my blouse. I did not rush. I let them see my defeated posture one last time. I loaded my suitcase into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, closing the door and shutting out the sound of the storm. I sat there in the dark, gripping the steering wheel, and looked back at the glowing windows of the estate. Beatrice and Crystal were standing in the living room looking out at me. They were watching me sit in the rain, convinced they had completely broken my spirit. I let out a long, slow exhale and smiled. What they did not know was that the Chicago house had 3 missed mortgage payments and was already in pre-foreclosure. The bank was days away from seizing the property, and the diamond bracelet Crystal had just claimed was purchased on David's maxed-out credit card. It was another massive high-interest debt that Crystal was eagerly preparing to legally assume. They thought they had won a palace and stolen jewels, but they had just locked themselves inside a sinking ship. The glorious fireworks would absolutely begin on Friday. The drive from the suburban estate to downtown Chicago took 40 minutes, but felt like crossing into an entirely different world. I navigated the rain-slicked streets toward the Gold Coast, pulling my car into the secure underground garage of a soaring luxury high-rise. I did not need to scramble for a cheap motel or beg friends for a place to crash. Weeks ago, when I first uncovered the staggering depth of his financial deceit, I quietly secured a penthouse-level short-term rental. The concierge greeted me by name as I stepped into the gleaming marble lobby. I swiped my private access card and rode the private elevator up to the top floor. Stepping into the expansive apartment, I was met with panoramic views of Lake Michigan and the city skyline. The space was impeccably designed with modern furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows that let the city lights spill across the dark hardwood floors. I set my single suitcase down in the expansive master suite. Beatrice and Crystal had kicked me out of the house assuming I would be destitute and broken. They had spent years mocking my career, dismissing me as a boring corporate drone who simply crunched numbers. In their insatiable greed, they never once bothered to ask what a senior forensic accountant and managing consultant at a top-tier financial firm actually earned. They never knew about the substantial, independent wealth I had built, completely outside of David's purview. My personal accounts, untouched by his fraud and fully protected from the impending federal fallout, were enough to sustain me in absolute comfort. I unpacked my few belongings, taking a long, hot shower, letting the stress of the evening wash down the drain. For the first time in weeks, the crushing weight of pretending was beginning to lift. I was not a victim seeking shelter. I was a strategist settling into my command center. While I enjoyed the quiet sanctuary of my new apartment, the Ohio family was busy celebrating their fabricated triumph 300 miles away. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere in Columbus was electric with unearned arrogance. Beatrice, Derek, and Crystal believed they had successfully bullied a terrified widow into surrendering an $18 million logistics empire. They believed the Chicago estate was theirs free and clear. Emboldened by the illusion of their impending wealth, they immediately began spending money they did not actually have. Crystal drove straight to the most exclusive European auto dealership in the city. She strutted into the showroom demanding to test drive their flagship SUV. The salesman, seeing her designer handbag and hearing her boast about her late husband company, catered to her every whim. Crystal did not want to wait for the transfer documents to clear on Friday. She wanted the car immediately. She filled out the financing paperwork using her own personal credit history and the remaining available balance on her personal credit cards to cover the massive down payment. She drove off the lot in a vehicle that cost more than most residential homes, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just anchored a massive new debt to her own name right before a federal tax lien was about to obliterate her financial standing. Derek and Beatrice were equally reckless. They spent their Thursday afternoon at the premier country club in the suburbs. Beatrice had long resented the wealthy women who belonged to the exclusive club. Now she felt she had the financial ammunition to put them in their place. She and Derek met with the membership director, acting as if they were already corporate royalty. The initiation fee was astronomical, requiring a hefty upfront deposit. Derek, eager to prove his new status as the head of a family dynasty, pulled out his own credit cards. He maxed out 2 separate lines of personal credit to secure the family membership. They toasted with champagne in the club dining room, laughing about how easily they had outsmarted me. They were throwing themselves into a pit of high-interest debt, fully expecting the Foster Freight corporate accounts to pay the bills by Monday morning. Back in Chicago, I spent Thursday afternoon sitting at the glass dining table in my rental, reviewing the final logistical details. My laptop glowed in the dim afternoon light as the rain continued to pour over the city. My phone buzzed on the table. It was an email forwarded from my attorney, Daniel. The original sender was Richard Caldwell, and the tone of the message was dripping with aggressive condescension. Caldwell was practically vibrating with greed. He stood to make a staggering contingency fee off the transfer of the company, and he was terrified that I might suddenly find my spine and back out of the deal. His email was a relentless barrage of legal threats and bullying tactics. He demanded that the paperwork be expedited immediately. He insisted that all parties meet at his downtown office at precisely 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon to finalize the irrevocable transfer of all assets and liabilities. The final paragraph of his email was written in bold, aggressive text. He stated that if I delayed the signing by even a single hour, he would advise his clients to pull the settlement offer entirely and proceed with a brutal public probate battle that would drag my name through the mud. I read the email twice, letting the sheer arrogance of the man wash over me. Caldwell thought he was applying pressure to a cornered animal. He thought his aggressive tactics were forcing me to capitulate. He was so blinded by the prospect of a multi-million-dollar payday that he was completely ignoring the fundamental rules of corporate acquisition. A few minutes later, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Daniel's name. I answered, leaning back in my chair and watching the gray clouds drift over the lake. Michelle, Daniel said, his voice thick with genuine professional concern. I just sent you Caldwell's latest demands. Have you read them? I just finished, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly calm. He seems very eager to get this done. He is being incredibly reckless, Daniel warned, the frustration clear in his voice. I have never seen a lawyer push an asset transfer of this magnitude so quickly. It borders on malpractice. He is threatening to cancel the entire settlement if we do not sign right at 2 o'clock tomorrow. Let him threaten, Daniel, I said. We are going to be there right on time. We are going to give him exactly what he is demanding. Michelle, you need to understand what they are doing. Daniel pressed, his voice growing more urgent. In a normal transfer of corporate ownership, there is always a mandatory period for auditing. But Caldwell is moving so fast to lock you out that he is completely bypassing standard procedure. He just sent over the finalized contract writers. They explicitly waived the 30-day financial due diligence period. They are legally agreeing to accept Foster Freight and the estate exactly as is, without ever looking at the internal books. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I looked at the rain lashing against the glass, thinking of the $19 million in federal penalties ticking like a time bomb beneath the surface of David Company. I thought of Caldwell arrogance and the Ohio family relentless unearned greed. I know Daniel, I said steady and resolute into the quiet room. That was the whole point. Daniel sighed on the other end of the line. He was a meticulous corporate attorney who lived and breathed compliance, and seeing a rival lawyer behave with such reckless arrogance offended his sensibilities. I kept my phone pressed to my ear as I navigated my mouse across the large monitor on my dining table, opening the massive digital document Caldwell sent. The file was labeled Final Assumption of All Corporate Assets and Liabilities. It was the legal instrument of my supposed destruction. Let us go through his exact phrasing, I said, scrolling down to the third page of the dense legal text. Read me the liability transfer clause again, Daniel. I want to hear it out loud to make sure I am not hallucinating. I heard the rustle of papers as Daniel adjusted his headset. Caldwell really outdid himself here, Michelle. He drafted this to be an absolute ironclad lockout. He is so paranoid that you are going to bleed the company dry through phantom consulting fees that he created a legal cage around his own clients. I scanned the highlighted paragraph on my screen as Daniel read the words aloud. The Ohio family, through their aggressive legal representative, was demanding full, immediate, and irrevocable ownership of Foster Freight. In Caldwell, absolute greed to ensure I could not touch a single cent, he had explicitly written that I would forfeit any claim to any current or future liquid assets, intellectual property, or operational revenue. He wanted to make sure that I walked away with nothing but the clothes on my back and a bruised ego. But to secure that total financial victory, he had to build an impenetrable wall against any claims I might make against the estate in the future. He assumed that because I was a senior forensic accountant, I would try to invoice the company for my previous consulting time, or saddle Beatrice and Crystal with fabricated debts to recoup my losses. So he drafted a sweeping blanket clause meant to shield them from me. The buyers hereby assume full and exclusive responsibility for all corporate liabilities, debts, liens, and obligations both known and unknown associated with Foster Freight and the estate of David Foster. I read the words known and unknown one more time and felt the final piece of the trap slide perfectly into place. Caldwell had drafted the clause to keep me from ever coming back for hidden profits, consulting fees, or future claims. In his arrogance, he had also made sure his own clients would inherit every buried obligation David had left behind. Daniel went silent on the other end of the line. He understood it now. The clause was not a shield. It was a locked door. Once Beatrice and Crystal signed the EPA fine, the IRS lien, the defaulted mortgages, the vendor debts, and every poisoned corner of Foster Freight would legally move to their side of the table. We just have to get them to sign before the public notices hit, I said quietly. Laptop chimed with a sharp, urgent notification. I minimized the legal draft and opened my encrypted email portal. A message had just arrived from my contact at the Federal Regulatory Office. The subject line was flagged with high-priority red markers, indicating an immediate shift in status. My heart skipped a heavy beat as I opened the message and read the brief, scrambled text. The room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. "What is it?" Michelle Daniel asked, hearing my sudden silence over the phone. My eyes scanned the glowing screen, tracking the federal timeline. The Environmental Protection Agency is advancing their schedule, I said, my voice tight. The internal investigation phase is wrapping up faster than anticipated. They are preparing to file the formal public notices against Foster Freight. When Daniel asked, his tone sharpening with immediate alarm. Tomorrow morning, I replied, feeling a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. The press release regarding the $14 million illegal dumping fine might leak to the financial news outlets before noon. The timeline was no longer just tight. It was a razor wire that was about to snap. Caldwell was arrogant and greedy, but he was not entirely incompetent. He had paralegals monitoring the corporate registries and business news wires. If the EPA fine leaked to the press on Friday morning, Caldwell would absolutely see it. Any basic news alert associated with Foster Freight would flag on his system. If he saw a $14 million federal penalty attached to the company, he would instantly realize the trap. He would kill the deal immediately, advise Beatrice and Crystal to walk away, and I would be left holding the radioactive remains of my dead husband's crimes. Daniel swore softly over the phone. If Caldwell sees that news before 3 o'clock, the assumption contract is dead. He will pull the settlement and leave you with the wreckage. We have less than 24 hours, Michelle. They waived the 30-day financial due diligence period. Daniel warned, his voice tight. I smiled into the phone. I know, I said. That was the whole point. I woke before dawn on Friday morning, the skyline outside my penthouse windows beginning to turn a pale shade of purple. The city was quiet, but my mind was racing through the intricate timeline of the day. The Environmental Protection Agency was preparing to release their public notices, and if that $14 million fine hit the financial news wires before I secured the signatures, my entire strategy would collapse. Richard Caldwell was a greedy man, but he was not blind. He had automated alerts set up for David Company. I needed to buy myself a handful of critical hours. I made a pot of black coffee and sat at my kitchen island, pulling up a private contact number on my phone. I dialed the direct line for a senior director at an elite crisis management firm. I had spent the last 3 years consulting for them, untangling embezzlement scandals for their clients. They owed me several favors. The director answered, sounding exhausted, but alert. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I explained that an impending federal environmental notice regarding Foster Freight was going to go public, and I needed it buried. I did not ask him to kill the story, because that was impossible with federal agencies. I needed him to use his media contacts to delay the syndication. I needed the major financial outlets to hold the press release off their news feeds until late afternoon. The director hesitated, warning me that holding back a federal release was difficult and would burn political capital. I told him I was cashing in every favor he owed me. He sighed heavily, but agreed to make the calls. He guaranteed me silence on the main wires until at least 4 o'clock. I thanked him, hung up the phone, and let out a long breath. The temporary dam was built. Now I needed to guide my targets into the valley before it broke. It was time to get dressed for my final performance. I walked into my closet and bypassed the tailored suits and silk blouses I typically wore to client meetings. Instead, I selected a plain, boxy gray suit I had kept buried in the back for years. It was drab, poorly fitted, and entirely unremarkable. I pulled my hair back into a severe bun and applied no makeup, allowing the natural exhaustion of the past few weeks to show on my pale face. I looked exactly like the broken, defeated, and exhausted widow Beatrice and Crystal desperately wanted me to be. I took a cab to the financial district, arriving at the arbitration office 15 minutes before our scheduled 2 o'clock meeting. The lobby was a symphony of frosted glass, imported mahogany, and corporate wealth. The receptionist guided me into a corner conference room offering sweeping views of the Chicago River. My attorney Daniel was already there, sitting quietly at the long polished table reviewing his notes. He looked up as I entered, his eyes scanning my drab attire. He offered a knowing smile but said nothing. We sat in silence, the heavy ticking of the wall clock echoing in the large room. The tension in my chest was a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. I had spent weeks enduring insults, evictions, and the agonizing discovery of my husband's secret double life. All of it had inevitably led to this specific room on this specific afternoon. At 5 minutes to 2, the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open and the Ohio family made their grand entrance. They did not just walk into the room, they paraded inside like conquering royalty, arriving to claim their kingdom. Richard Caldwell led the pack, carrying a thick leather briefcase and projecting an aura of absolute smug victory. Behind him walked Derek, his chest puffed out and his chin raised, as if he had personally built the logistics company they were about to steal. Beatrice and Crystal brought up the rear, their presence immediately filling the quiet room with the overpowering scent of heavy designer perfume. Crystal was practically vibrating with unearned arrogance. She marched over to the table and casually dropped a massive brand-new designer handbag onto the polished wood surface. The gold hardware on the bag gleamed brightly under the recessed lighting. I recognized the brand instantly. It was an exclusive piece that cost thousands of dollars. She had bought it on credit just yesterday, entirely emboldened by the illusion of her impending wealth. Beatrice took the seat directly across from me, making a theatrical show of adjusting her expensive trench coat. She looked at my plain gray suit and let out a soft, cruel scoff. She leaned over to Derek, making no effort to lower her voice. "Look at her," Beatrice whispered loudly, a malicious sneer twisting her features. "She looks completely pathetic, just plain and washed out. I suppose reality has finally set in. She knows she is leaving here today with absolutely nothing." Derek chuckled meanly, leaning back in his expensive leather chair and crossing his arms over his chest. Caldwell ignored his client's terrible behavior, focusing entirely on Daniel. The opposing lawyer practically slammed his briefcase onto the table, unzipping it with aggressive haste. "Let us not waste any time," Caldwell said, his voice sharp and demanding. "My clients are ready to finalize the assumption of the estate right now. We expect full cooperation and zero delays. If there is any hesitation, we walk out that door and file for probate immediately." Daniel met Caldwell's gaze with cool, professional detachment. "We are fully prepared to proceed," he replied smoothly without missing a beat. "My client understands the terms of the complete surrender." The heavy wooden door opened again, and the neutral third-party mediator stepped into the room, holding a thick stack of pristine legal documents. He walked to the head of the table and set the heavy pile down with a solid thud. The sound seemed to reverberate through the floorboards. The point of no return had officially arrived. "These are the finalized assumption of all assets and liabilities contracts," the mediator announced, folding his hands formally in front of him. "This document transfers 100% of Foster Freight, including all current and future operational revenue, intellectual property, and corporate holdings, to Beatrice and Crystal Foster. Furthermore, it explicitly transfers all corporate and personal liabilities, both known and unknown, entirely to the buyers. Once these pages are signed, the transfer is immediate and irrevocable. Do all parties understand the finality of this binding agreement?" Beatrice and Crystal nodded eagerly, their eyes locked onto the paperwork like starving wolves eyeing a meal. Caldwell pulled a gold fountain pen from his breast pocket, already savoring his contingency fee. I let my gaze drift once toward the digital clock above the mediator's shoulder. 2:45 in the afternoon. If the federal notices surfaced before the signatures were complete, Caldwell would see the trap and drag his clients out of the room before the door could close. Before I could reach for the pen, Beatrice lifted one hand. She was not satisfied with taking the company, the house, and everything she believed David had left behind. She needed to humiliate me one final time. If you had been a real woman, maybe David would not have needed a real family in Ohio, she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the room. "Look at you now, Michelle. No husband, no company, no home. You leave this room with nothing." I lowered my head and let my shoulders fold inward. Derek smirked. Crystal gave a breathless little laugh, one hand resting possessively on the designer handbag she had bought on credit the day before. I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to make my eyes water, then reached for the brass pen with a trembling hand. Daniel gave me a grim nod, playing his part perfectly. I pressed the nib to the first dotted line and signed my name like a woman surrendering her last claim to the life she had lost. With every page I turned, the Ohio family inherited another layer of David toxic legacy. I signed away my right to the Chicago estate, surrendering a property days away from catastrophic foreclosure. I signed the transfer of the corporate fleet, passing along vehicles that were heavily leveraged and deeply in arrears. The scratch of the pen on paper was the only sound in the room. I flipped past paragraphs detailing operational contracts and vendor agreements, all of which were currently defaulting. And finally, I reached the last page. The critical sweeping clause Caldwell had drafted with such aggressive greed. The total assumption of all known and unknown liabilities. I let the pen hover over the final line. Caldwell leaned forward slightly, his breath catching in his throat, terrified that I might suddenly balk. Crystal was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white with greedy anticipation. I took a shaky breath, squeezed my eyes shut, as if resigning myself to my terrible fate, and signed my name for the final time. The mediator took the documents carefully, reviewing each page to ensure every initial and signature was properly executed. He adjusted his glasses, flipping through the dense legal jargon. Every single person at the table watched him, their collective breath held. He nodded, pulling his official notary stamp from his leather briefcase. The heavy mechanical clack of the stamp, echoing in the quiet room, sounded like a prison door locking shut. He pressed his seal onto the final page, binding the contract permanently. "It is done," the mediator stated, sliding the fully executed copies across the table toward Caldwell. "The transfer is now legally binding and irrevocable." Crystal did not even wait for Caldwell to review the finalized paperwork. She lunged forward, her manicured hands practically snatching the documents right off the table. She clutched the heavy stack of paper to her chest, as if she had just won the lottery. Her face was flushed with euphoric greed, her eyes wide and manic. She looked at me, her lips curling into a wicked, condescending sneer. Finally, Crystal mocked, her voice loud and triumphant. "The adults can take over now. You can go back to your pathetic little spreadsheets and your sad little life. Foster Freight belongs to its rightful owners." I did not flinch. I did not look away. I simply set the brass pen down on the table. The performance was over. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs completely. As I exhaled, the trembling in my hands vanished instantly. The slumped, defeated posture I had maintained for weeks evaporated like mist. I placed my hands flat on the table and slowly stood up. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, demanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. I stood at my full height, squaring my shoulders and lifting my chin. I looked directly at Crystal, stripping away the fragile widow facade and letting her see the cold, calculating executive I actually was. The sudden dramatic shift in my physical presence caught them entirely off guard. Beatrice stopped smirking, her cruel smile faltering into a look of genuine unease. Derek sat up straight, his brow furrowing in confusion as he looked from me to Daniel. Even Caldwell stiffened, sensing a sudden catastrophic shift in the atmosphere that he could not yet identify. "Actually," I said, my voice completely steady, echoing with a terrifyingly calm authority in the quiet room, "I have a few spreadsheets you might just want to look at right now." I reached down into the plain black canvas tote bag resting at my feet. The bag was intentionally ordinary, a sharp visual contrast to the ostentatious designer luggage Crystal had slammed onto the table moments ago. My hand closed around the smooth, rigid surface of a thin red folder. I pulled it out and set it down gently on the polished mahogany. The vibrant crimson color seemed to draw every eye in the room, like a magnet standing out against the sterile white legal documents we signed. I rested my fingertips lightly on the edge of the folder. The silence in the room had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of my defeat. It was the breathless, confused silence of a predator suddenly realizing it had walked blindly directly into a steel snare. Derek let out a confused scoff, shifting his weight in his expensive leather chair and running a hand through his hair. He opened his mouth to say something dismissive, but the absolute stillness of my posture stopped him cold. I did not look at Beatrice or Crystal. My gaze was locked entirely on Richard Caldwell. I pushed the red folder across the wide table. It glided smoothly over the polished wood, coming to a stop exactly an inch from Caldwell's pristine leather pad. "Since you opted to waive the 30-day due diligence period in your rush to steal my assets, I thought it only fair to provide the updated corporate ledger for your new company," I said, letting the syllables drop into the quiet room. Caldwell stared at the red folder as if it were a bomb. For a fraction of a second, his mask of absolute arrogance remained firmly in place. He let out a sharp, dismissive breath, his lips curling into a condescending smile. He thought this was a pathetic last-ditch effort by a desperate woman trying to manufacture leverage where none existed. He reached out with a manicured hand, his gold cufflinks flashing under the recessed lighting, and flipped open the cover. He expected to see arbitrary consulting invoices or minor vendor disputes. He expected something he could easily squash with a single legal threat. Instead, his eyes fell upon the official seal of the United States federal government printed on the bond paper. I watched the exact moment his reality shattered. It was a physical transformation that happened in slow motion. The smug color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw slackened and his breathing stopped entirely. The confident posture he had maintained all afternoon evaporated like mist. He lifted the first page and his hands began to shake. The paper trembled violently between his fingers, producing a dry, rattling sound that echoed loudly in the dead silence. His eyes darted frantically across the dense text, reading the staggering numbers and the undeniable federal mandates. He flipped to the second page, and the trembling moved up his arms into his shoulders. He was an experienced corporate attorney. He knew exactly what he was looking at, and he knew exactly what he had just allowed his clients to assume. He looked up at me, and his previous arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, wide-eyed panic. "What is this?" he stammered, his voice stripped of its booming authority reduced to a ragged, terrified whisper. I let a slow, sharp smile spread across my face. It was not a warm smile. It was a predatory look, the expression of someone who had spent weeks building a cage and had just slammed the lock shut. The first page is a $14 million environmental protection agency. Fine for toxic waste dumping at the Ohio facilities, I said, leaning forward slightly and letting the deep satisfaction bleed into my voice. It seems David decided that safely disposing of hazardous commercial chemicals was too expensive, so he instructed his managers to pour it directly into the ground for over a decade. The federal investigation has been ongoing for months. The final public notices are being issued as we speak. I paused, letting the sheer magnitude of that number settle heavily into the room. Caldwell was gripping the edges of the red folder so tightly his knuckles were stark white. And beneath it, I continued, my voice steady and relentless, is a $5 million Internal Revenue Service tax lien for corporate fraud, I said. David created phantom employees, shell vendors, and offshore accounts to siphon money out of the business. He stole from his own company to buy diamond bracelets and country club memberships. And the third page is the formal notice of default on the Chicago house. The mortgage is 3 months in arrears, and the bank is initiating foreclosure proceedings next week. The sprawling estate you were so desperate to claim is effectively worthless. The air in the room grew incredibly dense. The ticking of the wall clock seemed to grow louder, marking the seconds. Beatrice and Crystal sat completely frozen, their faces twisting in confusion. They did not understand the dense legal implications of federal liens and penalties. They only understood that the words 14 million and 5 million had just been spoken in relation to the company they had just absorbed. Crystal looked from the red folder to her designer handbag, her triumphant grin melting into a look of profound bewilderment. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Beatrice, however, refused to accept the shifting dynamic. She turned her furious gaze toward her lawyer, expecting him to shut me down and restore their victory. She could not comprehend why Caldwell was sitting there like a man handed a death sentence. "Richard, what is she talking about?" Beatrice demanded, her voice shrill and commanding, breaking the heavy silence. "Tell her to shut up. We have the signed contracts. The company is ours. She cannot just invent fake fines to scare us. Tell her the deal is done and she has to leave." Caldwell did not look at her. He could not tear his eyes away from the documents in the red folder. The heavy brass notary stamp had sealed their fate less than 3 minutes ago. He had drafted the irrevocable known and unknown liabilities clause himself. He had built the trap, and he had personally marched his clients inside. The sheer terror of his malpractice, the realization that he had just facilitated the absolute financial ruin of the Ohio family, hit him with the force of a physical blow. He dropped the papers onto the mahogany table as if they were literally on fire. The pages scattered, sliding across the polished wood. He slowly turned his head to look at Beatrice and Crystal, his face a mask of absolute sheer terror. He opened his mouth to try and articulate the catastrophic gravity of the situation, but his voice failed him completely. He just stared at them, his hands still shaking uncontrollably against his lap. I placed my palms flat on the table and leaned over the expanse of the polished mahogany, bringing myself closer to the woman who had spent years trying to destroy me. I looked into Beatrice's panicked eyes, ensuring she heard every single syllable of my final revelation. David was not a millionaire. I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifyingly calm register that filled every corner of the quiet room. He was a criminal drowning in $20 million of toxic debt. The silence in the arbitration room was absolute. It was a suffocating vacuum where all the oxygen had been violently sucked out. I stood tall, watching the words land in their minds. For an agonizing minute, no one moved. The only sound was the muffled hum of traffic far below. Then I watched the horrifying reality fracture their features. I spoke with the precise tone of an expert delivering a fatal diagnosis. "You were so blindingly eager to take everything I had," I said, locking onto Crystal's terrified face, "that you refused to look at what you were actually taking. You demanded to bypass the probate courts. You threw a tantrum to avoid a standard audit because you were terrified I might drag out the process. But the probate courts exist for a reason, Crystal. They exist to uncover the absolute truth." I turned my attention to Caldwell, who looked physically ill. "And your brilliant attorney was so eager to secure his contingency fee that he let you do it. He aggressively drafted an irrevocable assumption of liabilities contract to ensure I could not touch a single cent. But in his desperate rush to lock me out, he firmly locked you in. By signing that document to bypass probate Crystal, you did not just inherit a logistics company. You inherited the full weight of David federal crimes. You inherited his illegal dumping practices, his payroll evasion, and his toxic debt. It is entirely legally yours. The government does not care about your fabricated love story. They only care about who legally owns the company and its liabilities today, and thanks to Mr. Caldwell, that is you." Crystal let out a sound that was not quite human. It was a jagged shriek that tore from her throat and shattered the quiet dignity of the office. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The euphoric greed that illuminated her features minutes ago was completely gone, replaced by the frantic terror of a trapped animal. She looked down at the signed documents she was clutching. She had grabbed them like a winning lottery ticket, but now held them like a live grenade. "No!" Crystal screamed, her voice cracking. "No, that is a lie! David was rich. He bought me everything. He built a life for us. You are just a jealous, bitter woman making this up to ruin us." She threw the stack of papers onto the table and lunged forward. Her manicured hands clawed at the empty air as she scrambled over the polished wood, trying to physically reach me. Her designer heels slipped on the carpet, knocking her new luxury handbag to the floor and sending her keys spilling across the room. Derek sprang out of his chair, his face flushed a mottled red. He grabbed Crystal by the shoulders, hauling her back before she could cross the table. He physically restrained her, pulling her down into her seat while she violently thrashed against his grip. Derek was breathing heavily, his eyes wide and wild. He had spent the last 48 hours charging country club initiation fees and luxury cars to his personal credit, relying entirely on the assumption that millions were coming his way. Now he stared down total financial annihilation. Derek turned his frantic gaze away from his struggling sister and locked onto Caldwell. The tough patriarchal facade he had worn since arriving dissolved into pure desperate panic. He leaned over the table, pointing a shaking finger directly at the lawyer. "Tell me she is lying," Derek yelled, the sheer volume making the mediator flinch. "Tell me this is just some sick legal trick she is playing. You read the final contracts, Richard. You told us this was foolproof. Look at the papers right now and tell me she is lying to us." Caldwell did not answer immediately. He raised his hands, pulling a monogrammed linen handkerchief from his pocket to wipe the layer of sweat beaded across his forehead. His entire body was trembling. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, watching the ground crumble beneath his expensive shoes. He knew his career was effectively over. A malpractice lawsuit of this magnitude would strip his license and bankrupt his firm. He lowered the damp handkerchief and reached for the thin red folder. His terrified eyes darted across the official federal notices, reading the staggering penalty amounts and the irrefutable government seals. He swallowed hard, the dry sound audible in the tense room. He did not look at Derek. He did not look at Beatrice. He simply stared blindly at the polished wood. "She is not lying," Caldwell whispered, his voice cracking under the devastating weight of his monumental failure. He dropped the red folder back onto the table as if all the physical strength had drained from his arms. "The notices are legitimate. The federal liens are active and attached directly to the corporate holdings. By signing the irrevocable assumption waiver to bypass probate, you took on the entirety of the corporate burden." He finally looked up, meeting Derek, absolutely terrified gaze with a look of pure, absolute defeat. "You just assumed $20 million in federal debt," Caldwell stated, the dark finality of the sentence hanging like an executioner blade. "You are ruined." The heavy final words struck the Ohio family like actual physical blows. Crystal collapsed against Derek's chest, sobbing hysterically, her manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. Derek simply stared straight ahead, his mouth slightly open, completely paralyzed by the realization his life was over. Beatrice, however, refused to accept her absolute destruction. She had spent decades manipulating her son, demanding loyalty, and crushing anyone who stood in her way. Her initial shock quickly morphed into a frantic, desperate denial. She let out a guttural cry of pure, unhinged rage and lunged forward. "She did not aim for me." She went directly for the heavy stack of executed transfer contracts resting securely in the center of the table. She scrambled across the polished wood, reaching out with trembling hands to grab the papers and rip them into tiny pieces. She genuinely thought she could tear up the binding agreement and undo the nightmare. Before her desperate fingers could even graze the edge of the stack, Daniel moved. My attorney was incredibly fast and perfectly composed. He smoothly reached out and pulled the entire stack of documents out of her reach, calmly sliding the thick pile directly into his leather briefcase and snapping the locks shut. Beatrice instantly froze, her manicured hands suspended uselessly in the cold, empty air over the table. She stared at Daniel, her chest heaving with exertion and terror. "That belongs to me!" Beatrice screamed, pointing a violently shaking finger at his briefcase. "Give that back right now. We are instantly canceling the agreement. It is void." Daniel looked directly at her with cool, completely unwavering professionalism. He calmly adjusted his glasses and offered a slight, polite smile that contained absolutely no warmth. "I am afraid that is completely impossible, Beatrice," Daniel noted smoothly, his voice perfectly level. "As the mediator confirmed, the signatures are completely legally binding. Furthermore, we took the liberty of maintaining a secure connection throughout this entire meeting. Digital copies of the executed documents have already been transmitted and filed directly with the state registry." Beatrice let out a harsh, ragged, gasping breath, slowly slumping backward into her large leather chair. The trap had definitively and permanently snapped shut. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute, but it lasted only a fraction of a second before total chaos erupted. Derek slammed his heavy hands down against the polished mahogany table so hard the wood groaned under the impact. He turned his fury away from his terrified wife and directed it entirely at his mother. He screamed that she had rushed them into this absolute nightmare. He yelled that she had deliberately blinded them with her toxic obsession to humiliate me and take what belonged to me. Beatrice did not try to defend herself against him. The arrogant color drained completely from her face, leaving her skin a sickly, translucent shade of pale gray. She clawed desperately at the collar of her heavy silk blouse, unable to draw a full breath. Her legs gave out completely, and she collapsed backward into her large leather chair. She clutched her chest with both hands, hyperventilating loudly as her mouth opened and closed in a silent scream. The terrifying reality of her immense greed was finally settling deep into her bones. She had aggressively bullied her way into a binding legal contract that now forced her to pay millions of dollars she absolutely did not possess. Caldwell completely ignored his client and her severe medical distress. He was frantically flipping through the red folder, mumbling incoherently to himself, while his shaking fingers tore at the edges of the federal documents. He was desperately searching for a legal loophole he already knew did not exist. He was a dead man walking, and he clearly knew his prestigious legal career was completely over. The neutral mediator simply packed his briefcase, his face a mask of professional detachment, and swiftly left the room wanting no part of the impending implosion. I watched them all self-destruct for a few deeply satisfying moments, committing the chaotic scene to memory. Then I slowly reached up and buttoned my plain gray suit jacket. I turned away from the mahogany table and began walking toward the heavy glass doors. My attorney Daniel picked up his leather briefcase and fell into step right beside me. We did not rush our departure. We walked with the calm, measured pace of professionals who had just executed a flawless strategy. The sharp sound of my sensible heels clicking against the hardwood floor seemed to suddenly snap Crystal out of her paralyzed shock. She shoved her heavy chair back violently and scrambled to her feet. She completely abandoned her brand-new designer handbag, leaving the expensive monument to her false victory sitting neglected on the table, and ran frantically across the room to block the doorway. Tears were streaming heavily down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup and leaving dark streaks down her cheeks. Her eyes were wide and frantic, completely stripped of the arrogant cruelty she had worn just moments before. She reached out and grabbed my forearm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging painfully into the fabric of my suit jacket. She begged me to stop, to call the mediator back, to tear up the contracts and undo the transfer. Her voice was shrill and pathetic, echoing loudly through the luxurious office lobby. "You set us up!" Crystal wailed, her face contorting into an ugly mask of sheer panic. "You knew about this toxic debt and you set a trap to ruin us. You have to stop this, Michelle. You cannot do this to us." I stopped walking and looked down at her trembling hand gripping my arm. I then looked directly into her terrified, tear-filled eyes. I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my jacket, letting her arm drop uselessly to her side. "No," I corrected her, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any pity. "I just stepped out of the way and let you destroy yourselves." I stepped around her, leaving her standing alone in the doorway, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. Daniel and I walked into the waiting elevator, and the polished stainless steel doors slid shut completely, cutting off the sounds of the screaming Ohio family. When we reached the ground floor and stepped out into the crisp Chicago air, I finally took a deep breath. The suffocating weight I had carried since the moment I discovered David and his secret double life was entirely gone. I was completely free. The crumbling estate, the failing logistics company, the massive federal violations, and the deceitful family were no longer my problem. I spent the entire weekend resting in my quiet penthouse, watching the pale winter sun reflect brightly off the Chicago River. I drank good wine, read books I had neglected for months, and slept for 10 solid hours straight each night. It was the quietest, most peaceful weekend I had experienced in over a decade. I allowed my mind and body to finally recover from the relentless adrenaline of the past several weeks. But I knew the true conclusion of my strategy had yet to unfold. The legal machinery I had set in motion was slow, but it was absolutely unstoppable. By Monday morning, the notices that had surfaced late Friday had turned into formal enforcement actions, their public registries. The Environmental Protection Agency and the Internal Revenue Service officially and formally seized Foster Freight. The legal machinery of the United States government moved with swift, merciless efficiency. Because Crystal and Beatrice had willfully signed that binding transfer, claiming full corporate ownership and explicitly accepting all associated liabilities, the federal government immediately bypassed the worthless logistics company and went directly after the new owners. The federal agencies moved immediately to secure the debt, placing catastrophic liens on their personal assets in Ohio to cover the massive $20 million shortfall. Crystal was standing in the checkout line at a local grocery store when her debit card was suddenly declined. She received a frantic phone call from her local bank manager, informing her that her primary checking and savings accounts were entirely frozen by federal order. The modest suburban home she had lived in with David before his death, the house she thought she owned free and clear, was immediately placed under a strict federal lien, making it absolutely impossible for her to sell or borrow against it. she was instantly locked out of her own financial life. Beatrice experienced an even more devastating shock that same morning. The prestigious bank holding her extensive retirement accounts, the money she had obsessively hoarded and protected for decades, flagged her entire portfolio under a federal seizure order. She tried to log into her accounts online and found her balances showing zero available funds. Every single dollar she possessed was completely locked down by the government pending a full forensic audit of her direct involvement in the Foster Freight corporate fraud. Her lifelong pursuit of wealth had resulted in her total financial ruin. Derek was not spared the federal fallout. Because he formally linked his consulting business to the logistics company during the initial transition, hoping to siphon off fees, the IRS forcefully froze his accounts. He could not make payroll, bringing his business to a grinding halt. The brand-new luxury vehicle they proudly purchased on credit just the week prior, sitting gleaming in their driveway, was legally impounded by agents before noon. Authorities were preparing to auction it off to cover a microscopic fraction of the staggering debt they now owned. The trap had definitively snapped shut. Exactly 2 weeks had passed since the federal authorities dismantled the false reality Beatrice and Crystal had so arrogantly claimed. The dust settled over their ruined lives while I finally found a beautiful, unbroken rhythm. I stood in the spacious kitchen of my new penthouse apartment, pouring a steaming cup of premium dark roast coffee. The rich aroma filled the air, grounding me in the quiet comfort of my own space. Through the massive windows framing the living room, Lake Michigan stretched out like a sheet of dark blue glass under the crisp morning sun. The water was calm, completely undisturbed by the bitter winter wind rattling against the thick panes. I wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic mug, taking a slow sip and savoring the absolute silence. There were no hidden bank statements to uncover, no secret families to worry about, and no toxic mother-in-law demanding my submission. For the first time in years, the only life I had to manage was my own. I walked across the smooth hardwood floor and settled into the plush ivory armchair positioned directly facing the lake. I tucked my legs underneath me, enjoying the simple luxury of a slow Tuesday morning. My laptop rested on the glass coffee table nearby, displaying a few lucrative consulting offers that had come in over the weekend, but I felt no rush to answer them. I had secured my own financial independence long ago. I was safe. The sudden sharp ringing of my cell phone shattered the peaceful quiet of the apartment. The device buzzed aggressively against the tabletop, vibrating with a frantic energy that felt entirely out of place in my sanctuary. I let out a soft sigh and leaned forward, setting my mug down next to the phone. I expected to see Daniel's name on the screen calling with a final procedural update regarding the closed estate. Instead, the caller identification displayed an Ohio area code. The name Beatrice Foster flashed across the bright digital screen. I stared at the glowing letters, watching the phone ring once, twice, 3 times. My initial instinct was to simply hit the ignore button and let the call vanish into the digital void. I owed that woman absolutely nothing. I had spent years enduring her relentless cruelty, swallowing her insults, and trying to build a bridge she was determined to burn. But as the phone continued to vibrate, a quiet wave of curiosity washed over me. I wanted to hear the voice of the woman who had sat in that mahogany arbitration room and mocked my supposed failure. I wanted to hear exactly what absolute defeat sounded like. I reached out and picked up the phone, swiping my thumb across the screen to accept the call. I brought the device to my ear, but I did not say a single word. I simply waited. Michelle. Beatrice's voice crackled through the speaker, sounding completely unrecognizable. It was not the sharp, commanding tone she had used to terrorize me for over a decade. It was a wet, ragged sound choked with thick, heavy sobs. "Oh God, Michelle, please do not hang up. Please, you have to listen to me." I remained perfectly silent, leaning back into the soft cushions of my armchair and staring out at the calm blue water. I could hear her gasping for breath on the other end of the line, the sound of a woman undone by her own actions. "The IRS agents were here this morning." Beatrice wept, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic, desperate rush. "They came to my house, Michelle. They taped a seizure notice directly to my front door. They are taking my home. The bank will not return any of my calls. The manager told me my accounts are permanently frozen pending a criminal investigation into David corporate fraud. I went to buy groceries and my card was declined. I have absolutely nothing left. She paused, letting out a loud, agonizing wail that forced me to hold the phone slightly away from my ear. I listened to the raw terror in her voice, feeling a profound sense of detachment. She was experiencing the exact nightmare she had tried so desperately to inflict upon me. "You have to help us, Michelle," Beatrice begged, her voice dropping into a pathetic whine. "Crystal is losing her mind. Her house is gone and the government seized Derek's business accounts. They took his car. We are completely ruined. But you know how to fix these things. You spent years untangling corporate messes and embezzlement scandals. You are a forensic accountant. You know the tax codes better than anyone. You have to look at the paperwork and find a loophole. You have to use your expertise to save us." The sheer audacity of her request hung heavily in the quiet air of my living room. After years of treating my career as a tedious joke, after actively trying to leave me penniless and broken, she was now begging me to use my professional skills to rescue her from her own boundless greed. She expected me to swoop in and perform a miracle to save the very people who had conspired to destroy my life. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute clarity of my position. I did not feel any anger. I did not feel any residual bitterness. I just felt a cold, profound indifference toward the weeping woman on the phone. "I told you, Beatrice," I replied, my voice perfectly, even, and entirely devoid of emotion. "I am just a boring auditor. I do not have the capacity to provide the kind of warmth and support you need right now." "Michelle, please," Beatrice sobbed, her voice cracking with fresh panic. "I am sorry. I am so sorry for everything I said. I was wrong about you. David was a monster. He lied to all of us. You have to help me. I am an old woman. I cannot survive on the street. I will do anything you ask. Just tell me how to stop the federal agents." "You demanded David legacy," I said, cutting through her frantic apologies with surgical precision. "You sat in that arbitration room and fought tooth and nail for every single scrap of his estate. You wanted everything he left behind. Well, Beatrice, you got exactly what you asked for. Enjoy every single penny of it." I pulled the phone away from my ear, not waiting to hear her response. I tapped the red button, disconnecting the call and instantly silencing her desperate weeping. The apartment returned to its perfect, unbroken quiet. I navigated to my settings and permanently blocked her number, ensuring that she could never reach out to me again. I did the same for Crystal and Derek, systematically erasing their digital presence from my life. They were entirely in the past. I picked up my coffee mug, taking another slow sip. A few minutes later, a sharp chime sounded from the laptop resting on the glass table. I leaned forward, tapping the touchpad to wake the screen. A news alert had just popped up from a major local business journal. The bold headline detailed the spectacular collapse of a prominent Midwestern logistics company. The article exposed the secret Ohio family of the disgraced CEO. It revealed they were facing total bankruptcy and a federal investigation. I watched the final news alert flash across my phone screen, feeling absolutely nothing but a deep and profound sense of peace. I set the phone face down on the glass table and took one last look at the pristine morning view. The peace I felt was not a fleeting emotion. It was a solid, permanent foundation that I was ready to build the rest of my life upon. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug in the sink, and walked into my expansive master suite to dress for the day. I chose a tailored navy blue suit that fit perfectly, projecting absolute authority and sharp precision. I paired it with a simple silk blouse and my favorite silver watch. As I walked out of my building and stepped into my waiting town car, the crisp Chicago air felt invigorating rather than bitter. The drive to the financial district gave me time to reflect on the last time I had entered my consulting firm. Weeks ago, I had walked through those glass doors carrying the heavy, humiliating weight of a grieving widow whose husband had lived a secret double life. I remembered the hushed whispers, the sympathetic glances, and the suffocating pity that had followed me down the corridors. Today, the atmosphere was entirely different. When the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, The receptionist immediately sat up straighter. The polite pity in her eyes was completely gone, replaced by wide-eyed reverence. As I walked down the long central corridor toward my office, the hushed whispers were still there, but the tone had shifted dramatically. My colleagues were not gossiping about a betrayed wife. They were watching a master strategist who had just engineered the most spectacular corporate implosion the Chicago business world had seen in years. Several junior associates practically plastered themselves against the walls to let me pass, nodding with clear, undisguised awe. The news of the Foster Freight collapse and the subsequent federal seizure had dominated the morning financial briefings. Everyone in the firm understood exactly what had happened, and more importantly, they understood exactly who had made it happen. Before I could even reach my desk, my office phone rang. My assistant informed me that the managing partner requested my presence in his suite immediately. I did not feel the familiar flutter of anxiety that usually accompanied an unscheduled meeting with the head of the firm. I felt only a cool, steady confidence. I walked down the hall and entered the massive corner office overlooking the city skyline. Marcus was standing behind his heavy oak desk, reading a printed copy of the Morning Business Journal. He looked up as I closed the door behind me, and a slow, appreciative smile spread across his face. He gestured for me to take the leather chair opposite his desk, and he sat down heavily, folding his hands together. He did not offer any empty pleasantries or fake sympathy regarding David. Marcus respected competence above all else, and he was looking at me as if he were seeing me for the very first time. He tapped his index finger against the business journal on his desk, pointing directly at the headline detailing the federal liens placed on the Ohio family. "That was an incredibly dangerous game you played, Michelle. You allowed a deeply toxic, heavily audited liability to pass right through your hands, and you legally attached it to people who possessed absolutely no resources to defend themselves. The legal maneuvering required to bypass probate without triggering a federal block on your end was nothing short of brilliant. You effectively weaponized their own greed against them." I met his gaze without blinking, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "I did not create the liability, Marcus. I simply identified it, quantified its exact destructive potential, and allowed the most eager buyers to claim it." He laughed, a deep booming sound that echoed off the glass walls of his office. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "You demonstrated an unshakable composure under intense emotional and financial fire. Most people would have panicked when faced with $20 million in federal tax evasion penalties. You did not panic. You built a flawless legal trap and you let human nature do the rest of the work. That is exactly the kind of cold, calculated precision this firm desperately needs at the highest levels." Marcus opened a thick leather folder on his desk and turned it around to face me. He pushed a silver pen across the polished wood. "The executive board met early this morning to discuss the upcoming quarter, and your name was the only one on the agenda. We are officially offering you a promotion to senior partner. Furthermore, we want you to take full control and lead the entire corporate restructuring division effective immediately. You will have your pick of the best associates and complete autonomy over your client roster." I looked down at the partnership agreement resting on the desk. The compensation package was staggering, representing a level of wealth and institutional power I had worked toward my entire adult life. I did not need David or his crumbling logistics empire to secure my future. I had built my own empire, using my own intellect. I thanked Marcus, shook his hand, and told him I would return the signed documents by the end of the day. At noon, I took the private elevator down to the lobby where Daniel Thorne was waiting for me. We walked 2 blocks to an exclusive steakhouse where Daniel had reserved a quiet corner booth to celebrate our victory. The restaurant was dimly lit and smelled of rich roasted meats and expensive red wine. The waiter poured us 2 glasses of a bold Cabernet, and we toasted silently to a flawlessly executed strategy. Daniel took a slow sip of his wine and leaned back against the red leather booth, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "I have been practicing corporate law for 20 years. Michelle and I have never seen a trap snap shut with such devastating perfection. You handed them the exact weapon they needed to destroy themselves, and they thanked you for it." I cut into my steak, savoring the rich flavor. They were blinded by arrogance, Daniel. They genuinely believed that because I was grieving because I was a woman they perceived as a boring accountant, I would be an easy target. They assumed I was weak. Daniel laughed quietly, a sharp sound of genuine amusement. He set his wine glass down and looked at me with profound respect. They thought they were the predators. They did not realize they walked into the jaws of the apex predator. I smiled at his assessment, feeling the absolute truth of his words settle deep into my bones. We spent the rest of the lunch enjoying the magnificent food and discussing the bright future directly ahead of me. Later that afternoon, I returned to my quiet, spacious office and sat down behind my large desk. I pulled the heavy leather folder toward me and picked up my favorite silver pen. With smooth, confident strokes, I signed my name at the very bottom of the partnership paperwork. I had completely detached myself from the toxic ruin of David and his secret life. I was no longer a victim, no longer a grieving widow caught in a humiliating scandal. I had secured my own massive wealth and absolute corporate power entirely on my own merits. I closed the folder gently and looked out the window at the sprawling city. The future belonged exclusively to me. The days that followed my elevation to senior partner settled into a rhythm of absolute precision and quiet luxury. I spent my mornings in my corner office watching the sun rise over the Chicago skyline before diving into complex corporate restructuring cases. I moved through my life with a profound sense of lightness. I had meticulously excised the rot that David had brought into my world and replaced it with a foundation built entirely on logic, patience, and hard work. I was in total control of my environment. My penthouse was always immaculate. My financial portfolio was continuously growing, and my professional reputation was absolutely bulletproof. I had navigated the treacherous aftermath of the betrayal and emerged completely unscathed. The stark contrast between my serene reality and the catastrophic nightmare consuming the Ohio family was almost poetic. They had allowed blind, ravenous greed to dictate every single one of their actions. They had sprinted eagerly toward what they believed was unearned wealth, completely ignoring the glaring warning signs. I had simply stepped aside and allowed their own toxic desires to consume them. The fallout was absolute, and the consequences they now faced were permanent. The reports that reached my desk over the following weeks only confirmed what I already knew. Crystal's borrowed luxury vanished first. The house David had maintained for her was seized, the designer lifestyle disappeared, and the woman who had mocked my spreadsheets was forced into ordinary work just to survive, while Caldwell chased her for unpaid legal fees. Derek lost the swagger next. His attempt to attach himself to Foster Freight placed him directly under federal scrutiny, destroying his consulting business and leaving him facing questions from investigators he was not clever enough to answer. Beatrice's fall was the most public. The social circle she had ruled for decades shut its doors the moment the federal liens became headlines. Her home, her accounts, and her reputation collapsed together. The woman who once called me a temporary bankroll had finally inherited exactly what she had fought for: David's real legacy. The crisp evening air of Chicago carried the sharp bite of impending winter, but I barely felt the cold. I stood on the expansive balcony of my penthouse, resting my hands against the glass railing. Far below me, the city moved in a continuous ribbon of pulsing headlights and glowing street lamps. The towering skyscrapers rose around me like pillars of glass and steel, reflecting the spectacular orange and purple hues of the setting sun. This was the exact city David had always used to make me feel small. He had treated Chicago like his personal playground, parading around as a wealthy logistics executive while relegating me to the quiet corners of our shared life. He had built an elaborate illusion of success meant to intimidate everyone around him. Now, as I looked out over the sprawling, magnificent skyline, I realized that the city did not belong to his ghost. It belonged entirely to me. I raised the delicate crystal glass in my right hand and took a slow, measured sip of the rich red wine. The complex flavors grounded me in the present moment, perfectly contrasting with the chaotic memories that still occasionally drifted through my mind. I allowed my thoughts to travel back to that miserable rainy morning at the cemetery. I remembered the stinging physical shock of crystals striking my face. I remembered the sheer unadulterated venom in her voice as she claimed David and his entire fake life for herself. I thought about Beatrice and her cruel, relentless insults. She had stood over her son's grave and looked at me as if I were nothing more than a pathetic obstacle standing in the way of her inheritance. They had all viewed me with such absolute towering arrogance. Their cruelty had not started at the funeral. It had been cultivated by David over 5 years of marriage. He had spent over a decade subtly, systematically dismantling my self-esteem. He wove a narrative where he was the brilliant risk-taker, and I was just the boring accountant holding him back. He had instilled a deep, persistent feeling of inadequacy inside my chest. He made me believe that my dedication to numbers, my insistence on logic, and my quiet professional life were character flaws. He wanted me to feel dull, so he could shine brighter in his own manufactured spotlight. And for a very long time I had actually believed his toxic narrative. I had let his loud, charismatic lies overshadow my quiet, steady truth. But standing here tonight, surrounded by the silent luxury of a life I had earned completely on my own, I saw the situation with absolute crystal clarity. My boring career had been my ultimate salvation. My supposedly tedious intellect had been the very thing that shielded me from total destruction. The forensic accounting skills David had so frequently mocked were the exact tools I needed to dissect his massive web of deceit. My ability to read complex ledgers, to understand federal tax codes, and to trace hidden liabilities had literally saved my life. While Crystal and Beatrice relied entirely on loud, entitled aggression, I had relied on hard, undeniable mathematics. While they were blinded by their frantic, desperate greed, I was guided by cold, unwavering logic. My quiet restraint had always been my greatest superpower. I had not screamed or thrown tantrums in that arbitration room. I had not begged for my share of the estate or tried to fight them for a company built on a foundation of federal crimes. I had simply stepped back and allowed their own toxic desires to dictate their actions. I had given them exactly what they demanded, and I let them run headfirst into a trap of their own making. I took another sip of wine, feeling a profound wave of gratitude for the woman I had become. The paralyzing fear that gripped my heart when I first discovered the Ohio family was completely gone. The lingering shadow of David and his endless betrayals had been permanently erased from my world. The wind picked up, slightly swirling off the dark waters of Lake Michigan and rustling the fabric of my silk blouse. I closed my eyes for a moment, simply breathing in the clean, freezing air. I felt incredibly alive. I was no longer the betrayed wife hiding in the background. I was the senior partner of a prestigious consulting firm. I commanded the respect of the most powerful executives in the city. I had walked through an absolute inferno of deceit and emerged completely untouched. The heavy, crushing weight of the past was finally gone, replaced by a soaring, limitless sense of potential. I turned away from the railing and slowly walked back inside, sliding the heavy glass balcony door shut behind me to block out the chill. The interior of my penthouse was warm and inviting, filled with soft ambient light and the faint, comforting scent of vanilla. I set my wine glass down on the polished marble kitchen island. As I reached to loosen the collar of my blouse, my personal cell phone began to vibrate against the stone countertop. The bright digital screen illuminated the dim kitchen. I picked up the device and saw a priority email notification from my firm's secure server. It was a direct communication from the board of directors of a massive international manufacturing conglomerate. They were seeking immediate high-level corporate restructuring assistance. The contract they were offering was a multi-million-dollar retainer specifically requesting my new division and asking for my personal oversight. I slowly read the staggering numbers on the glowing screen, and a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. True power does not come from a man and his fake empire. It does not come from loud, arrogant demands or from stolen wealth. True absolute power comes from sharp intellect, from quiet, enduring patience, and from knowing exactly when to step completely out of the way and gracefully let your enemies destroy themselves. True power is rarely the loudest voice in the room. We are often taught that justice requires a grand confrontation, a screaming match, or a bitter fight to claim what we believe is rightfully ours. But sometimes the most devastating form of justice requires absolutely no aggression at all. It requires the quiet strength to step back and let the natural consequences of greed take their inevitable course. When individuals are driven by ego and a desperate need to tear others down, they ultimately blind themselves to the traps they are setting for their own lives. They become so entirely focused on winning that they fail to realize the prize they are fiercely fighting for is entirely toxic. Real security cannot be inherited from a foundation of lies or stolen through relentless manipulation. It has to be constructed patiently through your own intellect and unyielding integrity. When you finally recognize your own fundamental worth, you completely stop needing to prove it to people who are stubbornly committed to misunderstanding you. You simply stop playing their games. Instead, you focus all your energy on building an independent reality that no one can ever take away from you. The absolute greatest revenge is not active destruction, but personal elevation. It is removing yourself from the chaos, allowing the fire to burn out behind you, and confidently walking forward into a spectacular future you created entirely on your own merits. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic situation and let someone face the absolute consequences of their own actions? Share your story in the comments below. If you found strength in this journey of reclaiming personal power, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of ultimate resilience and triumph.